There is a building in Detroit that changed the world. You have heard its name. You have heard its music. But you have never heard this story. In 1958, on a cold autumn night, a young man stood beneath a flickering streetlight, singing to absolutely no one. His voice drifted through empty sidewalks, past closed shop windows, into the dark. He had no audience. He had no record deal. He had nothing but a melody and a feeling that something was about to begin. The street was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a city after the factories close and the last bus is gone. But his voice cut through it like a blade of light, clear, warm, full of something that had no name yet, but would soon have 1,000. That young man would go on to record the very first song under one of the most iconic music labels in history. His voice would open a door that the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, and the Temptations would all walk through. And yet, if you ask most people today who started Motown, they will not say his name. His name was Marv Johnson. And what happened to him is one of the most quietly heartbreaking stories in American music. How does the man who sang the first note of a revolution end up as a footnote in his own story? Stay with me. Let me know where you are watching from. And if you have never heard this name before, I promise you will not forget it after today. Before the bright lights, before the fame, before anyone had even whispered the word Motown, there was a boy in Detroit whose entire world was built on sound. Marv Johnson was born on the 15th of October, 1938, in a city that breathed music the way other cities breathed smoke. Detroit in those years was a place of factory whistles and church bells, of steel and soul. His mother worked long hours to hold the family together. His father, like most men on the block, disappeared into the automobile plants before sunrise and came home after dark. But Marv didn't grow up hearing machines. He grew up hearing voices. Every Sunday, the church choir would rise, and the walls of the small congregation would seem to shake with something holy. That is where Marv first opened his mouth to sing. Not on a stage, not for an audience, but in a wooden pew surrounded by his neighbors, reaching for something he could feel but could not name. Outside of church, the city offered its own kind of education. Jazz clubs lit up the avenues after midnight. Barbershops hummed with four-part harmonies that spilled onto the sidewalk. The radio carried rhythm and blues into kitchens and living rooms, giving a generation of young black kids a soundtrack for their dreams. Marv soaked all of it in. By the time he was a teenager, he had joined a local vocal group called the Junior Serenaders. They performed at school dances, at community picnics, at any gathering that would give them a few minutes and a microphone. They were not famous, they were not polished, but they had something raw, something real. And Marv, even then, had a quality in his voice that set him apart. It was smooth but urgent, gentle but full of ache. The kind of voice that could make a simple love song feel like a confession. People who heard him in those early days said the same thing. There was something in the way Marv sang that made you stop what you were doing. Not because he was loud, because he was honest. His voice did not perform emotion. It carried it the way a river carries everything that falls into it downstream. One evening, while performing at a local carnival, something shifted. In the back of the crowd, half hidden in shadow, a young songwriter named Berry Gordy stood listening. Gordy was nobody yet. He had melodies in his head and dead in his pockets, but he had ears, and the moment he heard Marv sing, he knew he was hearing something that the world needed. After the show, Gordy walked up to Marv. The two of them talked for hours right there under the carnival lights. They talked about music. They talked about what it meant to be young and black and full of dreams in a city that didn't always make room for dreamers. Gordy told Marv he was going to start a record label. Marv told Gordy he believed him. Soon after, Gordy introduced Marv to a young singer and writer named Smokey Robinson. The three of them became inseparable. They spent nights crowded into small apartments, writing songs on scraps of paper, harmonizing until the neighbors banged on the walls. None of them had money. None of them had connections, but they had a vision so clear it felt inevitable. Smokey later said that those nights were some of the happiest of his life. Three kids from Detroit with nothing but their voices and their nerve, inventing a future that nobody had given them permission to imagine. They did not know it then, but they were rehearsing for a revolution. Detroit in the late 1950s was not kind to that vision. The music industry was controlled almost entirely by white-owned labels. Black artists were expected to stay in their lane, to accept bad deals, to be grateful for crumbs. Gordy saw that and refused it. He wanted to build something different, something owned by the people, run by the unit, and made for the world. Marv believed in that dream before anyone else did, before there was a label, before there was a studio, before there was a name. He believed, and that belief was the very first brick of what would become Motown. Years later, people would ask Marv what those early days felt like. He would smile and say it felt like building a house in the dark. You could not see what it would look like when it was finished. You just kept hammering and hoped the walls would hold. The walls held, and the house became a cathedral. But in those earliest moments, it was just three young men with nothing to lose and everything to prove, singing in a city that had not yet learned to listen. In early 1959, something extraordinary happened in a small, unremarkable studio in Detroit. Berry Gordy had finally done it. He had borrowed $800 from his family, scraped together every resource he could find, and formed a tiny record label called Tamla Records. The equipment was second-hand. The studio was cramped. The odds were stacked against them in every possible direction. But Gordy had one thing no amount of money could buy. He had Marv Johnson. Together, the two of them crafted a song called Come to Me. Gordy wrote the melody. Marv gave it breath. They recorded it in a single session, just a piano, a rhythm section, and that voice, smooth, sincere, full of something you could not fake. When the final take was finished, they both stood in silence for a moment. Something had just happened. They could feel it. Gordy later recalled that recording session as one of the most important moments of his life. Not because the song was perfect, it was not. The production was simple. The arrangement was bare. But the feeling was undeniable. It was the sound of a beginning. The kind of sound you recognize only in hindsight, when you realize that everything that came after grew from this single fragile root. There was a problem, though. Tamla had no way to distribute records nationally. Gordy could press the vinyl, but he could not get it into stores across the country. So he struck a deal with United Artists Records, a major label willing to carry Marv's music to a wider audience. In February of 1959, Come to Me was released, and it climbed. Slowly at first, then faster. By May, it had reached number 30 on the Billboard Hot 100. On the Rhythm and Blues chart, it landed at number 6. For a debut single from a label that barely existed, it was a miracle. For Berry Gordy, it was proof. Proof that his dream was not just a dream. For Marv, it was something deeper. It was confirmation that his voice, the same voice that had echoed through empty churches and crowded barbershops, had a place in the wider world. More songs followed. You Got What It Takes became his signature hit, climbing to number 10 on the Hot 100 and reaching number 2 on the Rhythm and Blues chart. In the United Kingdom, it broke into the top 7. A black artist from Detroit reaching audiences on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1960, that was almost unheard of. The song itself was a masterclass in charm. It moved with an easy confidence, the kind of record you could play at a dance or a dinner party and it would fit both. But beneath the surface, there was something deeper, a sincerity that could not be manufactured. When Marv sang that you had what it takes, you believed him. Not because he was convincing, because he meant it. And that difference between performance and truth was the secret that made everything he touched feel alive. His debut album, Marvelous Marv Johnson, arrived that same year. It was a collection of warmth, upbeat rhythms, tender ballads, and a voice that never demanded your attention but always earned it. Critics called him the gentleman of the new sound. Fans called him a joy. What made Marv different from other singers of his time was his restraint. He never oversang. He never pushed his voice past the point where emotion becomes spectacle. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that the most powerful thing a singer can do is hold something back. Let the listener come to you. Let the silence between notes carry as much meaning as the notes themselves. And somewhere in the background, Berry Gordy was watching, learning, building. Tamla Records was evolving. It was becoming something bigger. Something with a name that would soon be known around the world. Motown. Marv was its first face, its first voice, its first proof of concept. Every time his song played on the radio, Gordy's impossible idea became a little more real. Every chart position, every sold-out show, every letter from a fan was a brick in the foundation of an empire. When Marv performed at the early Motown reviews, he walked on stage in a sharp, dark suit and a quiet smile. He did not shout. He did not beg for attention. He simply sang, and the room went still. There was a warmth to him that audiences could feel, the kind of presence that made you lean in rather than pull back. He performed as though every single person in the room was the only one listening. During a tour in the United Kingdom, something happened that stayed with him for the rest of his life. It was a small venue, a cold evening, the lights barely working. Marv was halfway through You Got What It Takes when the entire crowd began singing along. Their accents twisted the words into something new, something different. Marv paused mid-line and smiled. His music had crossed an ocean. For a boy who grew up singing in a church basement in Detroit, it must have felt like the entire world had opened up. When a journalist asked him how it felt to be famous, Marv gave an answer that says everything about who he was. He said, "I'm just grateful to sing. The rest is noise." Back in Detroit, the small building on West Grand Boulevard was buzzing with a kind of creative chaos that would never be replicated. Musicians rehearsed in the basement until 3 in the morning. Songwriters scribbled lyrics on napkins and the backs of envelopes. Young women who answered phones during the day practiced harmonies in the hallway after hours, not knowing they would one day become some of the most famous voices in the world. It was messy and magical and utterly alive. And in the center of all of it was Marv. He recorded relentlessly. He traveled between cities on buses that rattled through the night. He shook hands with disc jockeys and radio programmers, always polite, always grateful, always carrying himself with the kind of dignity that made people trust him before he even opened his mouth to sing. He represented something larger than himself. He was proof that black music did not need to apologize for its existence, that it could be elegant and joyful and commercially successful without sacrificing an ounce of its soul. Every time Marv stood on a stage, he was not just performing. He was making an argument, and the argument was winning. At that moment, standing on the mountaintop of his career, everything seemed limitless. Motown was rising. His songs were everywhere. His name was known. But here's the thing about mountaintops. The air gets thin, the wind changes direction, and sometimes the person who climbed there first is the first to be forgotten when the crowd arrives. Fame does not fade all at once. It leaves slowly, like warmth draining from a room after the fire goes out. By 1961, Motown was no longer a fragile experiment. It was becoming a force. New artists were arriving every month. Smokey Robinson was writing hits that made the radio feel alive. Mary Wells was captivating audiences with a sophistication that redefined what a female solo artist could be. A young blind prodigy named Stevie Wonder was being called the future of music before he was old enough to drive. And Marv Johnson, the man who had opened the door for all of them, was starting to feel the cold draft of being left behind. It was not dramatic. There was no fight, no betrayal, no single moment where everything fell apart. It was quieter than that. His singles still charted, but they did not climb as high. His name still appeared in the papers, but further down the page. The audiences still clapped, but the rooms were a little emptier. It was the kind of decline that happens so gradually, you barely notice it, until one day you look around and realize the world has moved on without you. Inside Motown, the energy was shifting. Berry Gordy was building a machine. He had departments now, choreographers, stylists, vocal coaches. The sound was evolving from raw rhythm and blues into something smoother, something designed to cross over into the pop mainstream. It was brilliant strategy. But for Marv, whose voice carried the honesty and simplicity of an earlier time, there was less and less room. The cruelest part was that Marv understood exactly what was happening. He was not naive. He could hear the new records coming out of the studio. He could see the younger artists rehearsing their choreography in the hallways. He knew the sound was changing and that his voice, for all its beauty, belonged to a chapter that the label was already closing. But understanding something does not make it hurt less. Sometimes it makes it hurt more. He never complained. That was not who he was. When newer artists passed him on their way to the spotlight, he congratulated them. When his name was left off promotional materials, he said nothing. When a journalist once asked him if he felt overlooked, He paused for a long time and then said, "Somebody is still listening somewhere." Think about that for a moment. A man watching his legacy being rewritten in real time, and his response is not anger, not bitterness. It is faith, faith that somewhere, in some room, his music still matters. In 1964, Marv left United Artists and re-signed with Motown directly. It was a homecoming. But the home he returned to was not the one he had helped build. Motown in '64 was a powerhouse. Schedules, managers, departments, an entire corporate structure humming with ambition. For a man who came from the era of late-night jam sessions and handshake deals, it felt foreign. Like returning to your childhood house and finding strangers living in it. The hallways that had once echoed with improvised harmonies were now lined with schedules and production charts. The studio where he had recorded Come to Me was being used around the clock by artists whose names he barely knew. People walked past him in corridors with polite nods but distant eyes. He was respected, yes, but respect and belonging are not the same thing, and Marv could feel the difference. He recorded new music. I Miss You Baby reached number 39 on the Rhythm and Blues chart in 1966, a respectable showing, but a long way from the top 10. His voice had matured beautifully. It carried a weathered grace now, the sound of a man who had tasted both the sweetness of applause and the silence of being forgotten. But the industry did not reward maturity. It rewarded novelty. And Marv was no longer new. There is a photograph from this period that tells the entire story. Marv is standing backstage, holding a microphone, waiting to go on. His suit is pressed. His posture is calm. But if you look closely at his eyes, you see something that words struggle to capture. It is not defeat. It is not sadness. It is acceptance. The quiet, dignified acceptance of a man who understands that time moves forward even when the heart wants to stay. If you could freeze a single image to represent every artist who ever gave more than they received, it would be that photograph. A man dressed for a show that fewer and fewer people came to see, still standing tall, still holding the microphone, still ready to sing. To keep himself going, Marv began working behind the scenes at Motown. He took on roles in sales and promotion. The man who had once been the voice of the label was now selling records for other artists, walking into radio stations with someone else's music under his arm, using the same sincerity that once filled stadiums to convince a program director to give a new act a chance. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that. A man who helped build the house, now carrying bricks for others. When friends asked why he did not leave, why he did not try to start over somewhere else, his answer was always the same, because I was here when it began. That sentence holds an entire life in it. It is loyalty without condition, pride without arrogance, a man who defined himself not by what he received, but by what he gave. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching the world celebrate something you helped create while forgetting you were ever part of it. It is not the sharp pain of rejection. It is something duller and heavier, the slow ache of invisibility. And Marv carried that weight with a grace that most people will never understand. Through the late 1960s, Marv faded further from the public eye. Motown moved its headquarters from Detroit to Los Angeles, chasing the evolving sound of America. Marv, deeply tied to Detroit, stayed behind. He kept performing in small clubs. He kept writing. In the 1970s, he penned songs for other artists, including a hit for the Dells called Give Your Baby a Standing Ovation. Proof that even when the spotlight had moved on, his creative touch still mattered. He also continued touring, especially in the United Kingdom, where audiences treated him with a reverence that America had long stopped offering. In small venues across England, fans who had grown up with his records waited in line to see him. They sang every word. They shook his hand afterward and told him what his music meant to them. Those moments sustained him. Not financially, but spiritually. They were reminders that his voice had reached people in ways that charts and sales figures could never measure. But recognition at home never came, not really. While documentaries were made about Motown, while books were written about its rise, Marv's name appeared only in passing. A footnote, a brief mention, the man who started the story, reduced to a parenthetical. On the 16th of May, 1993, while preparing for another tour, Marv Johnson passed away suddenly. He was 54 years old. The news traveled quietly. No breaking alerts interrupted television broadcasts. No celebrities posted tributes. No moment of national mourning marked the passing of the man who'd given Motown its first breath. Just a few articles buried in the back pages of newspapers. A few phone calls between old friends who still remembered. And somewhere, on an old radio in a forgotten corner of a city that had changed beyond recognition, the faint sound of his music still playing for anyone who cared to listen. Those who knew him said the loss felt personal, even for people who had not spoken to him in years, because Marv was that rare kind of person whose goodness was not a performance, it was simply who he was. The kind of man who would cross a room to shake a stranger's hand, who remembered the names of sound engineers and janitors, who treated every audience, no matter how small, as though they were the most important people in the world. Berry Gordy described him simply, one of the first, and one of the best. Marv once said that music gave him everything, friends, lessons, and a reason to keep believing. That might have been the truest thing he ever sang. Because even in silence, even in absence, even after the world turned its back, Marv Johnson never stopped believing that what he had helped create was worth it. And every song that followed him, every hit that climbed the charts under the Motown name, carried something of his spirit in it, hidden in the rhythm, echoing in the melody, living quietly in the sound he helped bring to life. Long after the record stopped spinning and the applause faded into memory, something unexpected began to happen. In the 1990s, a new generation of music historians started digging into Motown's earliest recordings. They were searching for the roots, the very first voices, the original sounds that had shaped everything that came after. And again, at the bottom of every timeline, at the start of every story, they found one name, Marv Johnson. His records, long out of print, became treasures among collectors. Original pressings of Come to Me and You Got What It Takes were sought after like rare artifacts, relics of a moment in time when everything was still possible and nothing was certain. In 2015, the state of Michigan inducted Marv into the Michigan Rock and Roll Legends Hall of Fame. It was not a massive ceremony. There were no fireworks, but it was recognition. A quiet act of justice for a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. For the fans who had carried his memory through decades of silence, it was a moment of deep emotion. Some of them had been writing letters, signing petitions, and speaking to journalists for years, trying to make the world see what they had always known. That Marv Johnson was not a footnote. He was the foundation. Across the Atlantic, British audiences had never forgotten. In soul revival clubs from London to Manchester, disc jockeys still played his records as though they were sacred texts. When You Got What It Takes came through the speakers, people young and old rose to their feet, dancing to a rhythm that had first crossed the ocean decades ago. In the United Kingdom, Marv Johnson was never a footnote. He was a legend. Berry Gordy, in interview after interview, returned to the same phrase when speaking about Marv. He called him our first success story. That phrase carries weight. A man who had built one of the most successful entertainment companies in history still remembered the young singer who helped him believe it could work. In Gordy's voice, when he spoke those words, you could hear something that sounded almost like guilt. The awareness that the empire he built had not always been kind to the man who laid its cornerstone. Critics began to reassess. They wrote about his clarity of tone, his discipline, his natural charm. They described him as the template, the model for everything a Motown artist was expected to be. Polished, dignified, warm, real. Every artist who came after him, whether they knew it or not, was walking in his footsteps. Today, his influence does not live in headlines. It lives in something deeper, in the emotional texture of every classic Motown recording, in the blend of rhythm and sincerity that became the label's signature, in the idea that black music could be beautiful, joyful, and unapologetically excellent. Marv Johnson did not just sing the first song, he set the standard. There is a kind of legacy that does not need monuments. It lives in the air, in the way a melody makes you feel something you cannot explain, in the way a stranger hears a song from 1959 and somehow feels at home. That is the legacy of Marv Johnson. Not loud, not celebrated, but permanent, the first note of Motown. Still ringing? And perhaps that is the most fitting tribute of all, not a plaque on a wall or a statue in a park, but the sound itself. The sound that every time it plays, somewhere in the world carries with it the spirit of a young man from Detroit who believed that music could change everything. and was right. So here we are, at the end of a story that most of the world never knew needed telling. Marv Johnson was not the loudest voice. He was not the most famous name. He did not collect the most awards or sell the most records, but he was first. He was the one who stood in front of a microphone when there was nothing behind him but a borrowed dream and a rented piano, and sang as though the entire future depended on it. And in a way, it did. Every Motown hit that came after his, every icon whose name you know by heart, exists in part because a quiet young man from Detroit believed before anyone else that the dream was real. If you ever find yourself walking past 2648 West Grand Boulevard, the old Motown headquarters, pause for a moment. Listen, not to the traffic, not to the tourists. Listen deeper, because somewhere in the walls, in the floorboards, in the air itself, there is still a faint echo, a voice singing from somewhere just beyond memory. That echo belongs to Marv Johnson. His story reminds us that greatness is not always measured in fame. Sometimes it is measured in faith, in showing up when no one is watching, in building something that outlives your name, in giving everything and asking for nothing. Marv Johnson did not need a statue. He did not need a holiday. He needed what every forgotten voice needs, someone to say his name out loud and mean it. So tonight, do not just remember the hits, remember the man who made them possible. Do you think Marv Johnson ever got the respect he truly deserved? Tell me in the comments, share his name, say it out loud. Let someone new discover the voice that started it all. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Not for us, for the forgotten ones, for the first voices that the world stopped hearing, because we remember, and as long as we keep telling their stories, they will never fade. And the next time you hear a Motown song playing somewhere, in a car, in a coffee shop, in a movie, listen a little deeper, past the melody, past the harmony, past the bass line and the tambourine. Listen for the echo, that faint, beautiful echo of a voice that started everything. The world forgot, but we remember.